Marianne pulled her thin scarf tighter around her neck as she stepped out of the grocery store, bracing herself against the biting chill of the wind. The town was small and familiar, its streets lined with modest homes and the occasional shop window festooned with post-holiday sales signs. She adjusted the canvas shopping bag on her shoulder, its modest contents a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a small bundle of vegetables, a reminder of the careful budgeting that had become her daily reality. Her part-time job as a library assistant barely kept the bills paid, and luxuries like new boots or an occasional coffee out were long-abandoned dreams. Still, she carried herself with quiet determination, refusing to let her circumstances diminish her sense of hope. As she walked toward the bus stop, Marianne noticed an elderly man standing near the corner of the grocery store parking lot. He was hunched slightly forward, struggling to balance several overstuffed paper bags in his frail arms. One bag was already tearing along its seams, its contents threatening to spill out with every shaky step he took. His face was red from the cold and his breathing seemed labored. "Excuse me, sir. Do you need a hand?" Marianne called out, quickening her pace toward him. The man looked up, startled but clearly relieved to see her. "Oh, that's kind of you, miss, but I don't want to trouble you," he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "It's no trouble at all," Marianne replied, setting down her own bag and reaching for two of his. "These are far too heavy for one person to carry alone." She flashed him a warm smile. "Where are you headed?" "Just over there," he gestured down the block with a nod of his head. "I live in the small house on the corner with the blue shutters. It's not far, but these old arms aren't what they used to be." "Well, it looks like you have enough to feed an army," Marianne joked lightly as she shifted the weight of the bags in her hands. "I'll help you carry these the rest of the way." The man hesitated, his pride warring with his gratitude, but eventually he gave her a grateful smile. "Thank you, dear. My name's Mr. Everett, by the way, James Everett." "I'm Marianne," she replied as they began walking together down the quiet street. As they walked, Mr. Everett told her a little about himself. He had lived in the same house for over 40 years, having bought it with his late wife when they were just starting their family. His voice softened when he mentioned her, and Marianne could see the faint glimmer of tears in his eyes. His children were grown and had moved to distant cities, busy with their own lives, and his wife had passed away 5 years ago. Since then he had managed on his own, though it was clear the effort was taking its toll. "Some days I manage just fine," he said, pausing for breath halfway down the block. "But others, well, it feels like the weight of everything has grown heavier as I've grown older." Marianne nodded empathetically. "That's a lot to handle on your own. I'm glad I was here today to help." By the time they reached his house, Mr. Everett was visibly winded. Marianne climbed the steps ahead of him and waited until he unlocked the door before stepping inside. The house was neat but had the unmistakable air of a place that hadn't seen much company. A vase of wilted carnations sat on the dining table, and a faint smell of old books and lavender hung in the air. "Let me get these into the kitchen for you," Marianne said, carrying the bags toward the back of the house. She placed them gently on the counter and began organizing their contents: canned goods, fresh produce, and a carton of eggs. "You've already done so much," Mr. Everett said from the doorway, his voice soft with gratitude. "I can't thank you enough for your kindness. These days it seems like everyone is too busy rushing from one thing to the next to stop and help." "Busy or not, it's the right thing to do," Marianne replied simply. She glanced around the kitchen and noticed a few unfinished crossword puzzles on the counter. The room felt too large for just one person. She hesitated for a moment, then added, "If you ever need help with anything else, I live just a few blocks away. I'd be happy to lend a hand." Mr. Everett's face softened, and a genuine smile spread across his lips. "That's very kind of you, Marianne. You remind me so much of my late wife. She always found time to care for others." Marianne smiled, but the mention of his wife stirred a quiet ache in her chest. She thought of her own struggles and how loneliness had crept into her life as well. While she didn't have much to offer, she resolved to check in on Mr. Everett from time to time. A little companionship, she thought, could go a long way. Before she left, Marianne wrote her phone number on a scrap of paper and left it on the kitchen table. "Call me if you need anything," she said. As she walked back toward the bus stop, her heart felt lighter, as though helping Mr. Everett had lifted some of her own burdens. She had always believed in the power of small kindnesses, and today had reaffirmed that belief. What she didn't realize was that this seemingly ordinary moment would set off a series of events far beyond anything she could have imagined. Days turned into a week, and life went on as usual for Marianne. Her shifts at the library were quiet and uneventful, with the occasional nod of acknowledgement from regular patrons and the comforting smell of old books filling the air. Despite her financial worries, she took solace in the small pleasures of her routine. Yet, every so often her thoughts wandered back to Mr. Everett. She wondered how he was managing and whether he'd even consider calling her if he needed help. As it turned out, she didn't have to wonder for long. One chilly morning, as she was tidying up the library's children's section, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped into the staff break room and saw an unfamiliar number on the screen. "Hello," she answered hesitantly. "Marianne, dear, it's James Everett," the voice on the other end said warmly. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Mr. Everett." "No, not at all," she replied, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Well, I hate to impose, but I could use a bit of assistance, if you don't mind. There's a small repair in the house I'm struggling with, and I thought of you." "Of course," Marianne said without hesitation. "I'm off work later this afternoon. I'll come by then." That evening, Marianne arrived at Mr. Everett's home to find him standing in the doorway with a toolbox in hand. The problem turned out to be a loose hinge on one of the kitchen cabinets. While it wasn't a major repair, Mr. Everett's arthritis made tasks like this nearly impossible for him. Marianne tightened the screws and made sure the cabinet door swung smoothly before stepping back to admire her work. "Looks like new," she said with a grin. "You're a marvel," Mr. Everett said, his voice full of gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Marianne waved off the compliment, but the warmth in his tone stayed with her. Before she left, Mr. Everett invited her to sit down for a cup of tea. She agreed, and as they sat in his cozy living room, they fell into an easy conversation. He told her stories about his late wife, Margaret, and their adventures during their younger years. From road trips across the country to the simple joys of raising their children, every memory was tinged with love. Marianne found herself laughing at his anecdotes and listening intently as he shared his wisdom about life's trials and triumphs. In return, she opened up about her own life, her dreams of becoming a teacher, the struggles of living paycheck to paycheck, and the occasional loneliness she felt. "You have a kind heart, Marianne," Mr. Everett said, leaning forward in his chair. "And that's something money can't buy. Never forget that." His words struck a chord in her. She often felt as though her efforts weren't enough, that her struggles overshadowed her value. Hearing someone else recognize her kindness felt like a balm to her weary spirit. Over the next few weeks, Marianne found herself visiting Mr. Everett more frequently. Sometimes it was to help him with small errands or repairs. Other times it was just to share a cup of tea and chat. Their unlikely friendship blossomed, and she began to look forward to their conversations. On one particular visit, Marianne noticed something she hadn't paid much attention to before. The house was filled with small but beautiful things: a grandfather clock that chimed melodiously, intricately carved furniture, and paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum. She dismissed it as remnants of a well-lived life, assuming they were sentimental heirlooms rather than anything of great value. One day, as they sat in the living room, Mr. Everett asked her, "Do you ever dream of doing something more, Marianne?" His question caught her off guard. "More," she repeated, furrowing her brow. "Yes," he said. "Something beyond just getting by. Something that lights a fire in your heart." Marianne hesitated. "I used to dream of being a teacher. I wanted to make a difference, inspire children to love learning the way I do. But life has a way of rerouting your plans. Mr. Everett nodded knowingly. It does. But rerouted paths often lead to unexpected destinations. His words lingered with her long after she left that evening. Despite her modest circumstances, she began to feel a renewed sense of possibility, as though the simple act of sharing her dreams had given them weight again. Unbeknownst to Marianne, Mr. Everett was deeply moved by her generosity and her resilience. While she believed she was the one offering him companionship and support, he saw her as a rare gem, someone who gave without expecting anything in return. And deep in his heart, he began to form a plan to repay her kindness in a way she would never see coming. The snow had begun to fall lightly as Marianne approached Mr. Everett's house one late afternoon. She carried a small loaf of banana bread she'd baked that morning. It wasn't much, but she thought it might brighten his day. Over the past few weeks, their visits had become a welcome routine for both of them. For Marianne, it was a break from the stress of work and bills, and for Mr. Everett, it was a chance to share stories and laughter with someone who cared. "Marianne, what a lovely surprise," Mr. Everett said as he opened the door. His eyes lit up when he saw her holding the wrapped loaf. "And you brought me something? You spoil me, dear?" "It's just a little treat," she replied with a smile. "I thought you might enjoy it with your tea." As they settled into the living room, Marianne noticed something new. There were fresh flowers on the dining table, replacing the wilted ones she'd seen weeks before, and the faint scent of baking cookies wafted from the kitchen. "I see you've been busy," she remarked, gesturing toward the flowers. Mr. Everett chuckled. "Well, I've had some help. A cleaning service comes by once in a while now, and I decided it was time to spruce things up a bit." Marianne tilted her head, a little surprised. "That's great. It must feel nice to have some extra help." "Yes, it does," he admitted. "Though I have to say, it doesn't hold a candle to your company." They shared tea and banana bread as they talked about everything from the best ways to stay warm in winter to their favorite books. But as they laughed and chatted, Marianne's curiosity about Mr. Everett's past began to grow. There was something about him, his thoughtful manner, his impeccable home, and his casual mention of hiring services that hinted at a life more privileged than she'd initially assumed. Later, as she helped him with a minor task in the study, she couldn't help but notice the array of framed photographs and certificates lining the walls. One picture showed a much younger Mr. Everett shaking hands with a group of men in suits in what appeared to be a formal ceremony. Another showed him and his late wife at what looked like a gala, Margaret wearing an elegant gown and a radiant smile. "You look so happy in these photos," Marianne said, gesturing toward the gala picture. Mr. Everett glanced at the photo and nodded wistfully. "That was a special night. Margaret and I were celebrating a big milestone for our business. She was the heart of it, really." "Your business?" Marianne asked, surprised. "Yes," he said. "Margaret and I founded a company together when we were young. We poured everything we had into it. It wasn't easy, but over time it grew. By the time we retired, it was thriving beyond anything we'd ever dreamed." "What kind of business was it?" Marianne asked, intrigued. "Oh, we specialized in manufacturing and distributing sustainable household products," he replied. "It was Margaret's idea from the start. She believed we could build a company that not only provided for our family, but also made a positive impact." Marianne was impressed. She had no idea Mr. Everett had such a remarkable history. "That's incredible. You must have worked so hard to build something like that." "We did," he said. "But Margaret was the visionary. I was just the one who made sure the wheels kept turning." As he spoke, Marianne began to piece together the puzzle of Mr. Everett's life. The elegant furniture, the high-quality paintings, and even the professional cleaning service, it all made sense now. Everett wasn't just a kind, lonely man, he was someone who had experienced significant success and wealth in his lifetime. That night, as Marianne walked home, she couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. She admired Mr. Everett even more now not because of his past success but because of his humility. Despite his achievements, he treated her as an equal, never once flaunting his wealth or making her feel small. What she didn't know was that Mr. Everett's story was far from over. He hadn't shared the full extent of his plans for the future, or how they involved her. Winter loosened its grip on the town as the days grew longer, the snow slowly giving way to patches of budding grass. Marianne's visits to Mr. Everett had become a bright spot in her routine, and their friendship deepened with each passing week. She noticed how his health seemed to improve ever so slightly. He stood a bit straighter, his laughter came more freely, and there was a liveliness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, as Marianne helped Mr. Everett rearrange some books in his study, he cleared his throat. "Marianne, I've been meaning to ask you something," he began, his voice a little hesitant. "What is it?" she asked, turning toward him. "I'm hosting a small gathering this weekend," he said, fidgeting with the cuff of his sweater. "It's an annual tradition, though I've scaled it down in recent years. It would mean a great deal to me if you could come." Marianne blinked, caught off guard. "You want me to come to your gathering?" "Of course," he said warmly. "You've become a dear friend, and I'd love for you to meet a few others from my life. It won't be anything extravagant, just good food, a bit of music, and pleasant company." Marianne hesitated. She couldn't remember the last time she'd attended any sort of event, let alone one that might involve mingling with strangers. But the sincerity in Mr. Everett's voice made it hard to refuse. "I'd be honored," she said finally, her smile genuine. "Thank you for inviting me." When Saturday arrived, Marianne stood nervously in front of her closet. Most of her clothes were simple and well-worn, and she worried about not fitting in. After much deliberation, she chose her nicest dress, a soft blue knit that complemented her eyes, and paired it with a borrowed coat from a neighbor. When she arrived at Mr. Everett's home, she was struck by how different it looked. The curtains were drawn back, and warm light spilled from the windows. Inside, a handful of people mingled in the living room, chatting and laughing softly. A gentle piano melody played in the background, and the rich aroma of roasted vegetables and herbs filled the air. Marianne Mr. Everett greeted her at the door, his face lighting up. He looked sharper than usual in a tailored sweater and neatly pressed slacks. "I'm so glad you could make it." He introduced her to the guests, who ranged from long-time neighbors to a few old friends from his business days. Marianne quickly realized that many of them were kind and down-to-earth, and she found herself relaxing as the evening went on. At one point she was admiring a painting on the wall, a serene landscape of rolling hills, when an older woman approached her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the woman said. "James has quite the eye for art." "He does," Marianne agreed. "I've noticed so many lovely pieces in his home." The woman studied Marianne for a moment, then smiled. "You must be Marianne. James has spoken so highly of you." Marianne's cheeks flushed. "He has." "Oh yes," the woman said with a twinkle in her eye. "He thinks the world of you. And I must say, I can see why." Later in the evening, as the guests began to leave, Mr. Everett asked Marianne to stay for a moment. He led her to the study, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth. "I want to thank you for coming tonight," he said, sitting down in his favorite armchair. "It means a great deal to me." "Thank you for inviting me," Marianne said earnestly. "It was a wonderful evening." Mr. Everett nodded, then grew quiet, his expression thoughtful. Finally he said, "Marianne, there's something I need to tell you. Something I've been waiting for the right moment to share." Marianne's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Mr. Everett leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "I haven't been entirely forthcoming about my circumstances. You know about the business Margaret and I built, but what I haven't told you is that it left me with a considerable fortune. I don't say this to boast, but because it's important for what I'm about to ask of you." Marianne stared at him, stunned. She thought back to all the hints she'd noticed: the elegant furniture, the paintings, the professional services, but hearing it confirmed left her momentarily speechless. "I'm not sure what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Mr. Everett said gently. "All I want you to know is that I have the means to help those I care about. And Marianne, I care deeply about you. You've brought light back into my life in a way I never expected." Before Marianne could respond, Mr. Everett reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a small envelope. He held it out to her. "This is for you," he said. "What is it?" she asked, taking the envelope cautiously. "Open it," he urged. With trembling hands, Marianne opened the envelope and pulled out its contents. Her eyes widened as she saw what was inside: a check written in her name, the amount so large she could hardly process it. I can't accept this," she stammered, looking up at him. "You can," Mr. Everett said firmly. "And you will. Consider it an investment in your future. You've told me about your dream of becoming a teacher, and I want to help you make that dream a reality." Tears welled in Marianne's eyes as the weight of his generosity sank in. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You already have," he said with a smile. "By being the kind, selfless person you are." Marianne sat at her small kitchen table that night, the envelope from Mr. Everett still resting in her hands. The check inside was written for $50,000, an amount so staggering that she had to read it twice to believe it was real. It wasn't just more money than she had ever held, it was a lifeline, a key to a future she thought she could never afford. Her mind raced with possibilities, but her heart felt heavy with uncertainty. Could she accept such a gift? Was it right to take so much from someone, even if they insisted it was freely given? She barely slept that night, her thoughts swirling between gratitude and hesitation. By morning, she had made up her mind to talk to Mr. Everett. She needed to know why he had done this, and whether accepting his generosity would truly be as simple as he made it seem. When she arrived at his home later that day, she clutched the envelope tightly in her hand. Mr. Everett greeted her at the door with his usual warmth, as if he already knew why she had come. "Come in, dear," he said, stepping aside. They sat together in his living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. Marianne placed the envelope on the table between them. "Mr. Everett," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I can't thank you enough for this. I spent all night thinking about it, and I'm overwhelmed by your kindness. But I don't know if I can accept it. It's such a huge amount." Mr. Everett's expression softened. He leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "I understand how you feel, Marianne," he said gently. "But I want you to know something. Over the years, I've learned that the greatest joy of having more than enough is being able to share it with others. This isn't charity, and it isn't a handout. It's a way for me to honor the friendship you've given me." Marianne blinked back tears. "But $50,000, it's so much. I've never even dreamed of having that kind of money." Mr. Everett smiled. "And yet, for me, it's a small price to pay for the happiness of seeing someone I care about pursue their dreams. Marianne, you've brought light into my life when I didn't even realize how much I needed it. You gave me your time, your kindness, and your friendship. This is my way of saying thank you." His words settled over her like a warm blanket. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You already have," Mr. Everett said with a twinkle in his eye. "By being exactly who you are." Marianne nodded slowly, the weight of his sincerity sinking in. "If I accept this," she said, her voice firming, "I promise I'll use it to make the most of every opportunity." "That's all I ask," Mr. Everett replied. In the days that followed, Marianne began taking steps toward her long-held dream. The money allowed her to enroll in a teaching certification program she had only fantasized about. She also paid off her overdue bills, finally easing the constant worry that had hung over her for so long. As Marianne worked toward her goals, her friendship with Mr. Everett only grew stronger. She continued to visit him, not out of obligation, but because she treasured his companionship. They shared tea, stories, and laughter, finding joy in the simplicity of their connection. One spring afternoon, Mr. Everett surprised her with an idea. "Marianne," he said as they walked through the park, the air fresh with the scent of blooming flowers, "when you finish your program we should have a celebration. A proper one, just for us." Marianne laughed, the sound light and full of hope. "I'll hold you to that." The months flew by as Marianne balanced her studies and her part-time job at the library. When she finally completed her certification, she was offered a position as a teaching assistant at a local elementary school. It wasn't a grand beginning, but it was a start, and it filled her with pride and gratitude. On the evening of her first day in the classroom, she stopped by Mr. Everett's house to share the news. "I did it," she said, her face glowing with excitement. Mr. Everett's eyes sparkled. "I never doubted you for a moment," he said. "I couldn't have done it without you," Marianne replied, her voice full of emotion. "Nonsense," Mr. Everett said with a chuckle. "You had it in you all along. I just gave you a little nudge." A few weeks later, as Marianne stood in front of her first full classroom of eager, bright-eyed students, her heart swelled with gratitude. She thought of the challenges she had faced, the kindness that had brought her here, and the belief that one person could make all the difference. That evening, she sat at her modest kitchen table, reflecting on how far she had come. She knew she would never forget the man who had seen her potential and given her the chance to reach it. A single act of kindness had changed both of their lives, creating a bond that would endure forever.